Good afternoon to most of you. Don't know whether we have, obviously we have Professor William Randall Bill with us from another continent. It is indeed my pleasure and my privilege to be introducing Bill Randall to talk about this very increasingly important subject. William Bill Randall is professor of gerontology at St. Thomas University, New Brunswick, Canada. He is a graduate of Harvard University, Princeton Theological Seminary, and the University of Toronto. He has helped to pioneer a unique approach to the study of aging known as narrative gerontology, principal co-organizer of 3 international conferences called Narrative Matters in 2002, 2004, and 2010, and co-editor of the online journal Narrative Works. He is author or co-author of over 60 publications, including the books The Stories We Are, published by University of Toronto Press in 1995 and again in 2014, Reading Our Lives, Oxford University Press in 2008, and The Narrative Complexity of Ordinary Life, Tales from the Coffee Shop in Oxford 2015. Outside of his native Canada, he has presented on his research to colleagues in the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and France, the Czech Republic, and Spain. Among his more important research interests are narrative resilience in later life and narrative care in promoting emotional well-being among older adults. Professor Randall, I'm really looking forward to your keynote presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. I appreciate your kind words. Can I just make sure that I have my PowerPoint slides up here for everybody to see?
Yes.
One moment, please. There we go. There we go. There. Are they visible? Great.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, and Angela and Maria and the organizers of the conference. It's an honor to be part of this event. I'm humbled to be part of this event. And you are the experts in mental health, in qualitative research in mental health, psychotherapy, etc. And I'm just a gerontologist who has a particular interest in the storied complexity of human life and of aging. So what I hope to share with you today, this morning for me, this afternoon for you, are a few concepts and terms that I work with that may be of value to you and may provide a framework for you to think about some of the things that you do. I like quotations, and these are a few that kind of set the tone for my remarks. The first is by narrative psychologist Donald Polkinghorne, who writes that we are in the middle of our stories and cannot be sure how they will end. We're constantly having to revise the plot as new events are added to our lives. The African-American author Alex Haley, author of the book Roots, once said, "Every time an old person dies, it's like a library burns down." And then this last quote from Janet Ruffing, who's a professor of theology at Yale Divinity School. She says, "It matters how we tell the story." So my general objectives are to introduce you to a conceptual framework that I work with. There are other narrative gerontologists on the planet, thank goodness. But you're going to get my sort of take or my story of narrative gerontology. I would like to talk with you about the idea of narrative the narrative dimensions of resilience in later life, and maybe to look at interventions with older adults, insofar as some of you, perhaps many of you, work with older adult clients or participants, to see those interventions as a form of what could be called narrative care. So the topics I want to touch on really, are narrative resilience in later life, narrative psychology, narrative and aging, the narrative challenges of later life that I think there are, the concept of narrative environment, the field of narrative medicine, narrative care, and narrative self-care. It seems like a tall order, but I'm really going to be moving fairly quickly through these topics and not doing complete justice to them, of course. So resilience has been defined as the ability to transform adversity into a growth experience and to move forward. And many of the factors that have been identified as informing resilience at different stages of the lifespan are psychological factors, social factors, physical, medical, financial, cultural, spiritual factors, all well and good. But resilience, first of all, in later life has to date been rather understudied, and particularly the narrative dimensions of resilience. I speak of the narrative dimensions of resilience, making reference, for example, to the work of Jack Bauer and Sun Park, who write that psychological resilience in old age is intimately tied to self-identity. Therefore, I would say to one's self-narrative. I'll be talking about that shortly. Also, resilience always has, it's been argued, a narrative structure because stories need trouble. This is a comment made by Jerome Bruner, who's kind of a founding figure in the field of narrative psychology. A story has to have trouble. Something has to go wrong in order for the plot to kind of make things right. So adversity is maybe a necessary antecedent to resilience in life. Colleagues of mine in the Czech Republic, Eva Dubovska and her colleagues have written that rich, thick, coherent, and open life stories serve a protective function against adversity, and they represent, this is their phrase, internal resources that contribute to positive mental health. And even so, James Pennebaker suggests, to a stronger immune system. Colleagues in the Netherlands, Ernst Bolmeyer and Herman Westerhoff, have done some helpful research as fellow narrative gerontologists to show that life review and reminiscence interventions, which are really narrative interventions with depressed older adults, can increase their sense of mastery, meaning, purpose, self-esteem, and to that extent lessen their depression. Again, from Dubovska and also from Dan McAdams, resilient individuals narrate difficult life experiences with positive resolutions that remind them of how strong they really are. They tell stories also with more coherent plots, narrative, causal connections, and redemptive sequences. A redemptive sequence is when, life was difficult starting out, but through this and that and these opportunities, I did the best I could, and here I am today. At my little university, we've had a resilience project going on for some time, and our hypothesis has basically been that higher levels of resilience in later life are linked to having what we call a good, strong story. And I don't mean strong as in the sense of rigid and unchangeable, but strong in the sense of a spreading oak tree or a towering pine that has deep roots and branches that reach out. So narrative, as many of you know, has made inroads into a number of different disciplines. These are some book covers that indicate that. Narrative gerontology in the second row by my colleague and friend Kate de Medeiros at the Miami University in Ohio would be an excellent source to consider as well. So just to give you an at-a-glance sense of narrative psychology, at the beginning of my presentation, I had a quotation, which I didn't refer to, from a book by my friend Robert Mundell, who's a palliative care therapist. And he wrote a book called How to Become an Even Better Listener. And in that book, he makes reference to someone he met in his travels named Manny, who said, at 92, all I am is stories. So we understand ourselves, not in terms of statistics, but in stories. When somebody asks me, you know, Bill, tell me about yourself, I don't tell them my shoe size or my belt size or how old I am. I tell them a little story of some sort about who I am, where I've come from, where I'm going. Dan McAdams, who's well known in the field of narrative psychology, has attempted to define Erickson's classic concept of identity as a life story, by which he means an internalized and evolving narrative, elsewhere he says myth or guiding fiction, that provides our life with a sense of unity, meaning, and purpose. But that identity narrative connection is really quite complicated, as I'm sure you are aware, because our stories are constantly changing. Therefore, we're constantly changing. Autobiography scholar Paul John Eakin writes in one place, there are many stories of self to tell and many selves to tell them. There are also gendered patterns in how we story our lives. And I refer here to the work of people like Robin Fivish at Emory University in the United States. Over the lifespan, Kate McLean suggests women tend to have better developed, more complex, more nuanced life stories than men do. I may come back to that later. Also, our stories are entwined with other stories. If you're part of an intimate relationship, then where your story and your partner's story begins and ends becomes impossible to say. Our stories are embodied. Our bodies themselves tell stories. The looks in our eyes, the lines in our faces, the gestures, the postures, they tell stories of their own. And events and experiences get embodied into who we are. They're also embedded, I think, in larger stories still, certainly in the story of a family of origin. I know a number of you have a strong interest in family therapy, etc. I'll come back to that. Our stories are also rooted, due to our culture, etc., in what Mark Freeman calls the narrative unconscious. And I was so excited to have the opportunity to be in Malta for this conference, because I'm aware of the incredibly ancient history that lies all around the wonderful city of Valletta and surrounding communities. And I was so looking forward to soaking up that sense of the stories and the histories and the layers and layers and layers of lives and memories that everyday Maltese people sort of live in or draw from, I think you might suggest. Our stories, though, can become in some way dysfunctional, or as narrative therapists would say, problem saturated. So in short, as a student of mine once wrote in her learning journal, there's nothing simple about a life story. So a narrative approach to human development sees human beings as hermeneutical beings, as makers of meaning, in ways that squirrels, I don't know if you can see the squirrel there on the right-hand side, that comes to my bird feeder and takes the seeds away from the birds. I don't think that the squirrel spends a lot of time musing upon the meaning of his or her life, but that may be possible, I don't know. But narrative is one of the key means that we humans have of making meanings. And it's been argued that the narrative impulse is hardwired into our brains. I'm not a neuroscientist, I probably need one, so I can't attest to the merits of that concept. I also like to suggest that each of us lives in our own little world, our own little story world, with our own distinct storying style. Now, our story worlds are connected and enmeshed with other people's stories, obviously. And lastly, on this slide, the identity and narrative connection continues to develop and to change as we age, which brings up narrative and aging, or narrative gerontology. These are some book covers that have come out again, Kate de Medeiros' book, and on the lower left, the book that I was able to write with Elizabeth McKim called Reading Our Lives, The Poetics of Growing Old. So from a narrative perspective, the focus in aging is on the inner or the biographical dimensions of aging, as opposed to the biological. And there's a lot of emphasis in gerontology on the biological and the biomedical dimensions of the aging process, all well and good. But a narrative perspective, I think, provides a different starting point for thinking about what aging is, and maybe can point to a more positive counter story of aging, because there's prevalent, at least in North America, an overarching master narrative of decline as regards what aging is. Aging is seen as a downward slide towards disease, decrepitude, and death. And that influences, I think, a lot of how a lot of older people themselves tend to understand who they are as older people. So a narrative perspective can envision, I think, a more positive potential of aging as regards meaning and wisdom, spirituality, and resilience, and can see aging as very possibly a process of actively growing old and not just passively getting old, if you get that distinction. This is my quirky, unusual perspective on narrative and aging, but I see our lives themselves, your life, my life, as quasi-literary texts or novels that we compose from within them as author or co-author, narrator, protagonist, and reader, more or less at once. Texts that become thicker and more layered inevitably as we age. And the narrative perspective sees us not as just one story, that's a very controversial notion, but really as many stories, many stories of many different types in our library, as Alex Haley would say. We have short stories about what we did after supper last night, and then we have long stories about that first marriage that we had, okay? There are subplots, there are chapters, there are me stories and we stories, there are secret stories, and there are what I would call signature stories, which I think of as the stories that we like to tell about ourselves when we're meeting somebody new, and we want to give them a sense of who we are and what makes us tick. I'll come back to that later. Obviously, I'm jumping over things in the interest of time. And a narrative perspective sees later life itself as pushing us to not just to tell, but as I would say, to read our unique stories. And therefore, it may be, later life may be what Mark Freeman, my friend and colleague in narrative psychology, calls the narrative phase par excellence. Here's a quotation from one of Mark Freeman's writings. He's the author of a wonderful book called Hindsight. He says, our lives are like richly ambiguous texts to be interpreted and understood, whose meanings are inexhaustible, whose mysterious existence ceaselessly calls forth the desire to know, whose readings cannot ever yield a final closure. That kind of makes me get all tingly inside. I really am inspired by the subtlety and the nuance that quotation from Mark Freeman conveys. The narrative perspective on aging builds on the idea that psychologists have argued that as we get older, we are more capable of what's been called post-formal thinking, the capacity to appreciate metaphor and symbol, to tolerate paradox and ambiguity. And that in itself may contribute to the increased urge for narrative reflection or for autobiographical expression in later life. If you have older adults in your family, you may have detected that there is an increased urge in many of them to tell their stories to you while there's still time. Again, another distinction from Jerome Bruner between the landscape of action that any story has and the landscape of consciousness or meaning. And I would suggest that as we get older, oftentimes our landscape of action narrows in because we're not as mobile or as autonomous as we used to be. But our landscape of consciousness or meaning can theoretically continue expanding. There's no limit to how much we can therefore keep narratively developing. And I would like to say that the developmental tasks of later life are mainly narrative ones. We know the concept of developmental tasks from child psychology. You know, when you're 2 years of age or 1 or 2 or 3, your tasks are to learn how to walk and talk and tie your shoes and go to the bathroom by yourself, okay? But there are developmental tasks in later life as well, which maybe aren't as talked about as much. And I think of them as fundamentally narrative tasks. I'll touch on a few here. The first one is, and by the way, in Canada, growing up, there was an expression that when you're a kid going to school, you're trained in the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. So if you want to play with, these are the 12 or 13 R's of later life, okay, among which is review. And that's classic Erik Erikson, who suggests that life review is important in the final stages of his psychosocial developmental trajectory. Another author has suggested that there's a philosophic homework that needs to be tackled in later life. Another R would be to remember, to pull ourselves together narratively, to resolve as best we can resentments or regrets or unfinished developmental business, to repair, to make amends or make peace with others in our lives, or to heal psychic bruises, to recycle, to pass on our stories and our wisdom to other people, to younger people, to our children, grandchildren, our community, and to rehearse, to prepare for the end of our life story and possibly beyond, however we might understand that to be. So a narrative gerontology, in addition to the developmental tasks of later life, and this is my take on narrative gerontology, sees later life as presenting us, however, with unique developmental challenges that are also primarily narrative in nature because they concern threats to our sense of narrative identity. But I think sadly, such challenges are often pathologized overmuch in the psychiatric terms and treated with a pill, when perhaps a good dose of narrative care might be just as helpful. I'll say more about narrative care later. So some of the narrative challenges, and they're all interrelated, of later life include what my colleague Clive Baldwin calls narrative loss, which is when, as you get older, perhaps you are institutionalized, there are fewer things, fewer routines, fewer people in your life to support the version of yourself that you're familiar with, okay? Narrative dispossession, another term coined by Clive Baldwin, my colleague at St. Thomas University, is when perhaps because we're experiencing some cognitive decline and aren't able to communicate or tell stories about our lives as well as we could before, it could lead other people to discriminate against us or to assume that because there's a story that can't be told, there's somehow less a person there. I call that stereotyping. We can stereotype people left, right, and center and dispossess them of their story because they're of a different race, different color, different orientation, etc. We can come back to that. Narrative disjuncture and disorientation are kind of linked when, for example, we lose the thread. I like to read detective mysteries in spare time, and I find that if I don't stay with a particular book night after night, I lose the thread and I have to go back to previous chapters to figure out who did what and when, because I can't make sense of what's happening in the present chapter. But I think, and I know that the work of some of you revolves around migrants and refugees and newcomers from other cultures. And I'm going to assume that a big issue that they experience is a profound sense of disorientation, or what would be called by Arthur Frank chaos narratives. I have a couple of slides here. I'm jumping around a little bit, but these two people here would be familiar to many of you, Michael White and David Epstein of narrative therapy fame. And I had the good pleasure to host David Epstein here in Fredericton for a few days, a few years ago. Persons experience problems, they write in their book, Narrative Means to Therapeutic Ends, when the narratives in which they're storying their experience do not sufficiently represent their lived experience. And there will be significant aspects of their experience that contradict these dominant narratives. That is a springboard for us to talk more about, and I can't talk about this because I don't have expertise in the field of what's called narrative psychiatry. And here's a cover of a book that some of you may be familiar with by Sue Ellen Hempkins, The Art of Narrative Psychiatry. Canada's own novelist, Margaret Atwood, writes in her book, Alias Grace. This is kind of an expression of narrative disorientation. When you're in the middle of a story, it isn't a story at all, but only a confusion, a dark roaring, a blindness, a wreckage of shattered glass and splintered wood, like a house in a whirlwind. It's only afterwards that it becomes anything like a story at all, when you're telling it to yourself or to someone else. The phrase debris, narrative debris, is also relevant here. A colleague of mine, the late John McIndy, did a lot of qualitative research with male prisoners in long-term penitentiaries in Canada. And he found that many of them had very great difficulty piecing a story about their life together. It's like all they have is so many bits and pieces, possibly because of the unusual narrative environment of a prison itself, where only certain stories can be told in certain ways. We can come back to that perhaps later. But I mentioned Arthur Frank. Some of you will know of his work. Here's The Wounded Storyteller, which really got him to be quite well known. And we've also hosted him here at our university too. Stories are chaotic in their absence of narrative order. The lack of any coherent sequence is a reason why chaos stories are hard to hear. Those of you who work in the therapeutic field may often have this experience of finding it very difficult to listen to stories told by people that are very chaotic stories because they're so close to the trauma and the disorientation. I wonder sometimes if the multiple losses and transitions of later life in themselves might push some older adults into chaos narratives. Just a question I raised for myself. Narrative imprisonment is when you're stuck in a regret regarding an unlived life or some self-image or whatever. It's what Eckhart Tolle might call a failed story. And here's my little cartoon for that. Narrative imprisonment. You might have had clients like this. They're holding on to some version of their life or of themselves or of the world. They want to let go of it, but they can't. So it's like, as we say in North America, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I mentioned narrative domination as a possible challenge. When our lives are dominated by a particular trauma or ideology, or in the words of Vilma Hananen, whom I know, and I know she's very much part of this conference process, hegemonic masculinity. And maybe men in particular are like this guy here, sticking to a particular story that's not necessarily very helpful for them. But here's what Salman Rushdie, the author, says in, I think he said this in an interview once: those who do not have power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless because they cannot think new thoughts. And lastly on this list, narrative foreclosure, which has been defined by my friend Mark Freeman as the premature conviction that your life story has effectively ended. And that it's simply too late to live meaningfully, okay? That there's no prospect of new adventures or chapters opening up. Now, you can be 15 years of age and your boyfriend or girlfriend says bye-bye, and it can thrust you immediately into a temporary state of narrative foreclosure. Like, what's the point of going on? My life, doesn't mean anything because he or she is not in it. The big story is over. And the only reasonable thing might seem for that person to do is to go down to the river and jump in. Now, I'm just suggesting that narrative foreclosure is a possibility at any stage of the lifespan, but perhaps later life in particular can make us vulnerable to narrative foreclosure. My gerontology colleagues in the Netherlands, Ernst Bolmeyer and company, suggest that narrative foreclosure, and this is a paper that we wrote back in 2011, may have significant consequences for mental health in later life and may be a mediating factor between major life events and depression. And I'm just going to suggest, and therefore possibly for suicide as well. These are not my areas of expertise, folks. I'm just throwing out some ideas. I think you could say in general that the narrative challenges of later life are exacerbated or are intensified by the losses that do tend to come as we get older, of mobility, of vision, of hearing, of autonomy, and by isolation. Many older adults who have survived COVID, the disease, have had to deal with the consequences of extreme social isolation. And I think we need others to help us work through the narrative challenges of later life. And those challenges can be intensified by the changing and often narrowing of our narrative environments due to institutionalization. So if I may shift gears a little bit, talk about narrative environment. I'm very conscious of the time, but I don't have a watch or a clock in front of me. So if you don't mind, I'm going to look at mine to see how.
It's half an hour.
Been at it a half an hour? Okay, well, I will speed things up a little bit and cut some corners. But I think the concept of narrative environment is quite intriguing. Again, it's a phrase that I got from Jerome Bruner. It seems to me that we story our lives not in isolation, but within an ever-changing web of social contexts and larger stories that we're moving in and out of. obviously our families, the family of origin that we started out in, the family that we may create with a partner and so forth, but the communities that we live in, the cultures we're part of, the professions that we pursue, the cultures that we live in, the marriages, friendships, and relationships, including clinician-client relationships. Those are unique narrative environments, I would suggest. And each narrative environment, whether it's a family, a marriage, a school, a city, or whatever, a culture, you could argue, has its own subtle, implicit rules for telling and listening, for the use of airtime, for what topics are okay and what topics are taboo. In my limited travels in this world, I've been very intrigued by differences in how people interact with each other in, say, Norway versus France versus the UK versus Germany versus Canada, etc. These are difficult differences to kind of pin down, but they're there. And each narrative environment provides templates or life scripts. Growing up in the Randall family, for example, there was an implicit script, I think, for me to follow, you know, as the only male in a family with two sisters. And I did follow that script on some level, but then I rebelled against it. But there was a template there that in that family and in that community, I was kind of aware of. I think each narrative environment has a unique set of narrative resources. Going back to the example of Malta itself, and I can't speak authoritatively at all, but there are overarching narratives, legends, myths, etc., that underlie, that inform the narrative environment of what it's like to live and to grow up in, say, Valletta or other parts of Malta. And each narrative environment has its unique ways of co-authoring us, for better or for worse. So narrative environments are, and you might think of, you know, this in terms of your work as family therapists, can be on the micro scale or the macro scale. You can talk about the narrative environment of a particular family, of a particular friendship, or of a particular culture. They can be, broadly speaking, these are crude distinctions, inviting or inhibiting of our narrative development, coercing or co-authoring, pardon the play on words, but de-storying versus restorying. And they can potentially be what my colleague Gary and Kenyon and I called wisdom environments. Maybe I can say more about that in the question and answer time. Insofar as those of you who work with older adults are aware that older adults often get pulled into the healthcare world as they get older and their bodies are not functioning as well. So entering a hospital or a nursing home is definitely a change in narrative environment, and it's therefore a restoring experience in some way or other that requires revising the plot, as Donald Polkinghorne would say. At best, it's just one short chapter in an overall story. You go in, you get your tonsils taken out, you get your broken arm fixed, you come back out. It's not the whole story of your life. But at worst, it can become a chronically de-storying experience where you're in the hospital for weeks and weeks and months, or the nursing home, and you might overhear staff referring to you quietly in the hallway as a gallbladder in 13B, or the horrible phrase that we have sometimes in the Canadian media where older adults who have no other place to go because there aren't enough rooms in nursing homes, they're in hospitals lining the walls and are referred to sometimes as bed blockers. Talk about stereotyping and narrative dispossession. So healthcare settings, and I'm not assuming that all of you have a healthcare connection, but this is important with respect to older adults. Obviously, healthcare settings have their own stories too, but the language and the exchanges within them tend to be dominated by what could be called a biomedical master narrative, where, and to use one of Bruner's distinctions, logical thought trumps, I can use that word trump in this context, narrative thought, okay? And people are viewed and interacted with at patients first and foremost, and persons second. Now this is crude and unfair, but there is a sense in which there's some truth, I think, to this. This is a sign that I've seen in the doctor's office here in my hometown. Now, the policy of this office that we will address no more than 2 medical concerns per patient per visit, which is great because doctors' offices are busy people. Doctors are busy people. Doctors' offices are busy places. But if you're an older adult and you've got diabetes, you've got a heart condition, you've got this, you've got that, you've got some depression going on, how do you limit yourself to just 2 medical concerns? I don't know how you do that, but it's a sign that kind of gives you an indication of the type of narrative environment that a medical setting, in this case, a doctor's office, is going to be. Thank goodness we have people like Rita Sharon. Some of you will be aware of her work. She's a medical doctor, but also a PhD in English literature. And in her book, Narrative Medicine, she writes that patient-centered care seeks an integrated understanding of the patient's world, their whole person, emotional needs, and life issues. Well, I like to say that the patient's world is their unique story world. And their stories are central to their identities, their feelings, their values, their beliefs, and their health. Because patients understand who they are, not in terms of statistics, their white blood count, their body mass index, their glomerular filtration rate, but in terms of stories, in terms of biography and not biology. Here's Oliver Sacks, some of you will be aware of his work, who writes in his wonderful book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Biologically and physiologically, we're not so different from each other, but historically, as narratives, we are each of us unique, or as I would say, novel. This is playing a little bit here, but insofar as some of you may work in a hospital context as social workers or psychotherapists, and you may find it's challenging to feel that your work is being valued and recognized. If we could put some medical language on some narrative challenges, it might help. I don't know, this is just an idea, but narrative arrest, as opposed to cardiac arrest, would be an acute case of narrative foreclosure. Okay, the doctor says you have 2 months to live with cancer. The story stops. It's been argued or proposed that the average nursing home in North America permits only about 6 minutes per day of contact time with the residents, because there's so many tasks that need to be done. So if that's the case and you're a resident, your story's going to dry up. So that would be what I call narrative atrophy. Narrative constipation would be there's a story in there that you don't know how to tell and you want to get it out. Narrative compaction would be you have to dig to get the story out. Narrative diarrhea would be the story is flowing, but there's little by way of substance. We've all, I think, interacted with people who have lots to say, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of stuff to hang on to there. Narrative pregnancy would be when there's the patient, the resident has a new story that's ready to be born, only waiting the right kind of listener like yourself to come along and be a midwife to help that new story, that new life to be born. So older people in healthcare settings are dealing not just with medical challenges, but with narrative challenges as well. So the question is, how can those kinds of settings become more restoring, rather than destoring, so people, residents, patients can meet their narrative challenges? And my simple answer to that would be through some form of narrative care. Arthur Kleinman, who's one of the pioneers in the field of narrative medicine, writes that few of the tragedies at life's end are as rending or as heartbreaking to the clinician as that of the frail patient who has no one to tell their life story to. And then you can't tell who you are unless someone is listening. So for me, narrative care is a fundamentally story listening. Here's a picture that I found somewhere. Grandmother is waiting keenly to have some conversation with her grandchildren or her children or whatever, but of course they're all checking their Facebook page or their text messages and so forth. So that's not what narrative care is. So narrative care is listening, attending closely to and for the stories by which people tell who they are. So narrative care for me is really about attitude as much as it is any particular activity. My mother is 99 years old. She'll be 100 in 2 months. She lives in a retirement home, a special care home. She has all of her faculties. She doesn't have dementia, thank goodness. But she has wonderful connections with many of the staff people, most of them much younger than her, who come and go and do various things with her and for her. And she has a nice quality of connection where they have a sense, you're Emma Randall, and you're from Harvey Station originally, and we remember your husband. And so she feels like her story in some way is being respected and honored. So it doesn't take very long, it takes only a couple of minutes for that narrative care to be expressed. So narrative care is about helping folks to tell their stories in ways that make them stronger. And it can be practiced between the lines of other activities. It can be informal or obviously formal, which is where we think of psychotherapy. Here I like what John McLeod writes in his helpful book, Narrative and Psychotherapy. He says, all therapies are narrative therapies. Whatever you are doing or think you're doing as therapist or client can be understood in terms of telling and retelling stories. The importance of listening to stories rather than just employing listening skills in general is that the story represents the basic means by which people organize and communicate the meaning of events and experiences. In the interest of time, these are practical things that I'm going to jump over, but there are obviously things that we can watch for when we enter into the presence of, the home of, or the room of an older adult, things that we can watch for that might give us clues as to their story world. And this can help us in practicing narrative care. Things that we can listen for. These are things that you would know better than I do if you're practicing therapists. What are the recurring phrases or themes or metaphors that a person uses when they're telling you about their life? What seem to be the main plot lines or subplots or chapters? Are there particular turning point stories or signature stories that you're hearing them tell you as their way of expressing to you who they understand themselves to be? Are there shadow stories? If somebody says, oh yeah, my third wife, she said, and then they go on to talk about something else, you think, well, wait a minute, the third wife, there's a story there. What's that backstory? Not that you can necessarily ask, but it gives you a sense of the story layeredness of that individual's life and world. What are the larger narratives that they're rooted in? What degree of narrative agency are they expressing? In one of our research projects, we interviewed people for our resilience project, and we found that those individuals, those older adults who scored highest on the resilience scale, were the ones who were more likely to say, I've got a story to tell. I want to write my life story. One woman said, and she'd had all kinds of adversity, lost husbands, had cancer, got displaced from her home. She said, I'm going to write my autobiography someday, and it will be a trilogy plus. So getting close to the end here, narrative care involves fostering spaces or narrative environments where people can step back and think of their lives as stories. When I encourage my students who are only like in their 20s to think of their life as a story of which they are the author and narrator, and there's chapters and subplots, they actually find it a refreshing and kind of liberating experience. And it helps them to step back from the stuff that they're going through and get some affectionate detachment from it. Especially when I say, okay, what would be the title of the story of your life so far? They have fun playing with that. And it can help those narrative care spaces can help people to identify and address the narrative tasks and challenges that they face, and maybe to air long buried shadow stories. I know when someone says to me, and you've had people say to you, I've never told this to anyone before, but that's a pretty special moment, maybe even a holy moment. And you have a sense that you're being used perhaps to help this person expand their story and to tell an event or something that they haven't known how to, haven't had words to tell, but need to and want to. So narrative care involves fostering spaces where people can keep their stories open and can keep growing old as opposed to just getting old. And here I have to confess that I have borrowed my title in part from a wonderful book by narrative therapists Barbara Wingard and Jane Lester. The title is Telling Our Stories in Ways That Make Us Stronger. And I think that sums it up beautifully. I have specific things I could say about narrative care with those who have depression, but I think you people already know this. I could say something about those who have practicing narrative care with those who have dementia, those who are dying. By the way, there's a picture of my good friend, Norwegian narrative gerontologist Oddgeir Sinus, who writes about the importance in palliative care, people who are dying, for them not to necessarily engage in some big grand review of their life, but to tell what he calls nostalgic stories. For example, I remember when I was a little girl growing up in Norway, the family, we would go to the hillside overlooking the fjord, and we would have the most wonderful picnic. Sorry, that's a very, very bad attempt at a Norwegian accent, and I invite any Norwegian to imitate my New Brunswick accent, please. But those nostalgic stories, he argues, can convey, or they are that an individual's effort in the very final days of their life to celebrate the sweetness, the preciousness, the most important dimensions of the life that they've lived. Benefits of life storytelling. Listen, I've gone through some of these already. So narrative care means, to me, being deep listeners. Deep listening, I think, elicits deep telling. It means listening in ways that help people become stronger. It means being story catchers. You may be aware of this book by the American author Christina Baldwin. Story catchers come whenever we are in crisis to remind us who we are. Story catchers entice our best tales out of us. They turn with a leading question, a waiting ear, and their full attention. Many of you who are practitioners, I'm sure, could identify with being story catchers. It's a very important task. So narrative care is not rocket science, but that does not mean it's simple. It's a subtle, intricate, delicate art. My colleague, Robert Mundell, author of that book, How to Become an Even Better Listener, says it's a nimble art. It's low tech, but it's high impact, potentially transformative or regenerative. I made up that word, for both the listener and the teller alike. I mean, I think it's possible for us to be with somebody, to help them gently start to turn maybe a tragic life story around to being more of an adventure story, not so mired in tragedy per se, although tragic stories have their own integrity and beauty. I think narrative care is as vital and important as dietary care or pharmacare, because lots of people really, as they get older, they really just need a good dose or dosage of narrative care, of listening. It's implicitly therapeutic, I would say therapeutic and healing, and it's core care because it goes to the heart, or as those of you who are French would say, le cœur of who a person is. And lastly, it begins at home because, as I like to say, in our stories lies our strength. That's a little book that I wrote recently. So narrative self-care, very important. If we're going to put ourselves out there as agents of restoring in other people's lives, young or old, we need to value and honor the complexity and the richness and the depth and the interestingness of our own stories, to strengthen our stories as much as we can by rendering them more open and resilient through various means of story work, such as journaling, memoir writing, maybe therapy, support group of some sort, or identifying and thinking about our own unique set of signature stories. I have one which I call my iron lung story, and I've written about this in various places. I found myself telling the story, writing it out, and then stepping back. Why do I tell that story? What's in it? The writer Jeffrey Kotler, in his book On Becoming a Therapist, his most recent edition, has a whole chapter on storytelling as fundamental to what therapy is about. And he invites the reader to dig into your own storied life. And for example, he suggests that we ask ourselves, what's a significant experience in our life that we haven't yet formed into a coherent story? Or what's a story that we frequently tell someone new that we meet and we really want to get to know us? I could go on, but I can't, and I shan't, and I won't. And I've already gone past my time. So I'll stop here. Thank you in multiple languages. Do we have time for some comments, questions, connections? And please take narrative care of yourselves.
Thank you very much. I invite participants to ask questions. Maybe we can take the PowerPoint off and see the audience.
Yep. I'm going to do that right now.
Maybe I'll ask the first question until others come forward with their questions. Can you tell us a bit more about your research with using this approach with older people?
Well, I'm not widely versed in research in the way that I know you folks are, but the research projects that I've been involved in the last number of years revolve around this idea of resilience in later life. And for example, we in the first part of our resilience project, we interviewed we sent out a questionnaire to about 110 people, 60 plus here in our area, and asked them to fill out the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale, which is just one of many scales that supposedly measures our resilience. And it consists of a number of open-ended, or a number of statements to which you're asked to respond. Like, for example, when I have difficulties in my life, I turn to my friends, or I'm usually able to deal with problems on my own, etc. So it's, and then you're asked to respond on a scale from 0 to 4. 0 is, no, this does not apply to me. 4, it always applies to me. So it's possible to score 100 out of 100. 4, because there's 25 such statements, 4 times 20, possible to score 100. So what we did was we took 15 of the people who scored really high, like between 95 and 100 out of 100. 15 who scored really low, like between 30 and 50 out of 100, and 15 who scored in the middle. So those were 15, 45 people. And then we had one of our research assistants do qualitative interviews, open-ended life story interviews. Tell me about your life, basically, is how the interview started, with 40 of those 45 people. And what we found in our data analysis was that those who scored really, really high often were more apt to be women than men, first of all. So there's that gendered thing I was talking about. They had all kinds of adversity that they talked about, the difficult things that they had gone through in their life. But they were also more likely to say, I've got a story I want to tell. I want to write my life story. I just need somebody to help me write my life story. So we found a kind of a pattern that thick, layered stories where the person told lots of little anecdotes with I said and she said and so forth, lots of detail, etc. They tended to score higher. Those who had a much less detail, what you could call rather thin stories, tended to score lower. Now that's not a Nobel Prize winning conclusion to draw, but it was an indication of a pattern that that we've continued to follow up more recently. And this is a sort of a diversion, but we found that what we did was we took a number of older adults just to kind of test our hypotheses. If resilience is linked to having a stronger story, if we take people through a workshop kind of experience where they're exposed to ways to explore their story, to write about their story, to think about their story, will that not translate into, higher scores on resilience, more internal resources? But in the process of doing that, we found that many of our interviewees made reference to particular objects in their lives that had significance, like a pile of letters that they'd kept from a romance back when they're in their teens, or a beer stein that had particular significance for them, or a picture or whatever. So we decided to go down, as you do sometimes in research, go down this rabbit hole of, okay, what's going on when people make reference to particular objects having particular importance for them. So we're in the process of finishing up a book project, which is called Things That Matter. the role of special objects in the stories of our lives. Again, I find that qualitative research just, it's full of surprises and little adventures that you're invited to go on. So that's not a very good answer to your good question, Angela.
But it's interesting. There is a question by Kirsty, no, not by Kirsty, by, it went up. It's about when in care, by Ashra Kanom. She sent it to me directly. She can ask it herself. If she's here, I can't see her now. Maybe I should read it. She says, is there harm caused if people are asked to retell their story constantly in healthcare? And she thanks you for your presentation.
Yes, there can be. It's a very delicate sort of area that we move into when we ask that question, tell me about your life. That may be an extremely painful question to have asked to you if you've had a lot of trauma and pain and difficulty and adversity that perhaps it's been very hard for you to kind of process or to think about. You know, when we ask that question of someone, we can't ask it lightly. We can't ask it sort of, hey, yeah, tell me about your life, as if everybody should be able to do that. But I think, you know, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? And that way of, I mean, I'm not modeling how you should ask that question, but I think that kind of open sort of way of asking the question can invite somebody to tell you what they want to tell you or are ready to tell you. But if they sense that you're listening in that close, respectful, kindly way, you have more experience in all of this area than I do. It can invite a person to go into that territory where they can start to put words and structure on events that they haven't known how to narrate. And that may be a part of the healing process.
Yeah, yesterday I was attending, maybe Clarissa, you can, I was listening to your, you know, debate on how you ask open-ended questions or not. Maybe you can say something about that and storytelling and narrative.
Yes, actually, Angela, I was thinking around exactly on that thing, because we had a conversation, I think after the presentation of Alicia Stringfellow, I think, where she used a biographical narrative method to ask about stories around trauma. And I shared how in my research, I gave people a choice whether to just say their story or whether they wanted me to kind of nudge them with prompt questions, so to speak. And most of the people who I asked said they would rather have these kind of small questions to help them on. And we talked about how, you know, I think how interesting it would be to unpack what happens at that moment when we do give people a choice and when we don't give people a choice, to talk about difficult stories for them. So yeah, that's what we were talking and thinking and writing about then afterwards.
Yes, it has yes, a lot of resonance to what is being said here. It's time, unfortunately. I cannot see any hands up, so maybe it's time to thank you for being with us. And it's been really interesting to listen to this approach that you use in older age. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela.
Thank you, William. Thanks.